Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Movie Mike, and if you're new here, I have a podcast called, Movie Mike's Movie Podcast. So if you're only here for the movie reviews, that's great, but I would love it if you would check out my podcast because I just did an interview with the entire cast of the movie I'm about to review. So I am going to reference that interview throughout this entire review. So if you're only watching on YouTube, I didn't want to leave you in the dark, but I rarely say this about the things I do. It's actually a really fun, great interview. You should check it out. But now, let's get into the review of Quasi. And this is the part where I jump back into the podcast, so here we go. So since we just talked to the cast, I felt it was only appropriate to do my review this week on the movie Quasi that we've been talking about. I almost thought about, for the first time ever, reviewing a movie with the people who created it, but realized that would probably be entirely awkward. I also want to share with you my entire experience going to my first ever movie premiere. I am just a big fan, if you can't already tell, of the Broken Lizard guys. So I already feel I'm coming from a bit of a biased place of I am just their target audience when it comes to these movies. When I walked into this theater, it was all a bunch of people who looked like me. That combined with getting to sit down and talk to them, it's an entirely different environment when you go to a premiere and the actual people who made the movie are watching it with you. So I know that going into this review, I'm wearing the freaking t-shirt of all things. But I will still give you my honest opinion on their new movie. Before we get into that, here is just a little bit of the Quasi trailer, which is a spoof on the Hunchback of Notre Dame, a spoof on Quasimodo, Broken Lizard style. Here's just a little bit of Quasi.
Quasi! 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 Come on, we're gonna be late. You know what your problem is?
Is it that I've got a fatty deposit the size of a giant gourd on my back?
Freak!
Hunchback.
Morning.
On 420, in a tale of love.
I very much like your rat.
And I yours.
Betrayal. And scandal.
So it's from the guys who brought you Super Troopers, the guys who brought you Beerfest, and it is an R-rated spoof on the Hunchback of Notre Dame. In this version of the story, you have Quasimodo, aka Quasi, who is trying to live a normal life, trying to find his purpose in the world in medieval France. And then he finds himself in this ordeal where both the king of where he lives and the Pope who comes to visit in town. The first thing I had to get used to watching this movie is all of the Broken Lizard guys play two different roles throughout the movie. It was a little bit jarring to see them go from one role to the other and try to focus in on what the story was trying to be early on in the movie. So once I got used to that, it really allowed me to enjoy the movie. But what really helped watching a comedy like this, a very over the top, a very raunchy, a very, I don't want to call it low brow, but it's very goofball. If you know the Broken Lizard guys, that is what they go for. And I feel like it's a very fine line of you finding it funny and you finding it dumb. I am the target audience. I find this stuff hilarious. And I was worried about that because when you go watch a comedy, the way you judge it on whether or not it's a good movie or not is does it make you laugh? And what really helped with this movie, and the ironic thing we talked about earlier is that it's going straight to Hulu. I haven't experienced watching a comedy like this in a very long time. And I wonder if I would have watched this movie at home on Hulu like everybody else is going to have to do, would I have the same experience? Because this was the first ever movie premiere that I went to. I've been doing this thing professionally now for probably 7 years. I've gone to screenings before, but it's a much different environment when the people who created the movie are actually there. So the entire Broken Lizard cast was there. Adrianne Palicki was there. So they came out before the movie, did a little intro talking about the film, watched the movie there in the theater, and then came back and did a Q&A afterwards. And I just felt like I was in this group that was a very safe place, and it was all these fans of all their movies, that it just felt so much more welcoming, and there was laughter throughout the entire movie. And when you hear other people laughing, it is infectious. And I felt good laughing at things. And it was just an experience I had to where I completely turned off my movie critic brain and just allowed myself to watch something fun for the sake of it being fun. And that is something that you don't really get when you watch a movie alone at home. So I wonder how this is going to translate to all of you who end up deciding whether or not to watch this movie, how that experience differs, because this is their first movie not coming out in theaters. And I really feel like a comedy needs to be seen with people. And we talked about in the interview how comedies are being made less and less. And I think it's because during the pandemic, we had that time where we stopped spending time with each other and we got used to it. And we got used to watching different types of things, and comedies were not being made, that we forgot how to watch comedies. Comedies are the best when you go and watch them with your friends. It gave me, feelings back to when I would go watch a movie on Friday night. You would want to go watch a comedy. You don't really do that anymore. We are so focused now on, consuming things on our own and telling other people about them. But when it comes to comedies, when you experience something by yourself, sometimes it doesn't hit the same way, especially with a Broken Lizard type comedy. Although a lot of their comedies, what they said earlier, a lot of people discovered them at different times. I never watched Super Troopers in theaters. I never watched Beerfest in theaters, but it came through the power of word of mouth. People telling me about that movie at school. It's a movie that people passed around the VHS tape so you could experience it by yourself. But then from there, you go back and you quote all these movies with your friends. A comedy is meant to be experienced among friends. And that is exactly how I felt watching this movie. It was watching it with other like-minded people, and then also having the people there who created it and seeing them be genuinely excited to share this with people. I found that was an important factor for me too, because for somebody who watches and talks about movies all the time, it's all I think about is movies. I don't always put a human element to it. I think if I come on and talk about a movie I didn't like, it's not going to affect them, but they have so much passion for their movies to the point to where they're out here doing this tour, promoting this because they believe in it so much. It really gave a human factor for me to root for. It still had to be a good movie. I wasn't going to enjoy it if it was terrible, but it definitely felt like a personal touch that I haven't really experienced with any other movie. I know they try to put these teasers now at the beginning of movies where it's the actors coming on before it starts, saying thank you for watching it in the theater the way it was intended to be seen. But it's a whole different level when they're actually there with you. It actually feels like they care about their art. But when it comes to period pieces, I will have to say that is a genre that is right there at the bottom. It goes Christmas movies and period pieces of movies I just can't get into. The only period piece movie that I just straight up love and would consider one of my favorite dramas is The Favorite, a movie I was not expecting to love. I don't like classical music. I don't like movies where people are dressed funny and talking in weird accents. It's just hard for me to get into a movie like that. I was also just coming off of Dungeons and Dragons, so I'd already been in a similar pool of a type of movie like this. But that really kind of gets thrown out the window when it comes to this movie because it's so off the wall, because it's so zany, because it's so crude. It didn't feel like any of those type of movies. Other movies have done this before. They took obviously a lot of inspiration from Monty Python, which is why I believe this movie was so self-aware. They make jokes about the same actors playing different characters throughout this movie. And while it is a spoof on the story of the Hunchback of Notre Dame, it's really a story about two friends. And that is what is at the center of every single Broken Lizard movie. It's a story about friendship, about people you just want to hang out with. It was a little bit tougher to do that with medieval characters, but they got there at the end. I will say the only part of the film that lost me a little bit was the third act. It got a little bit clunky there towards the end. Unlike all of their other movies where the third act is where they really win you over, where something very ridiculous happens, this movie kind of walked off in a stumble for me. First act, second act kept the plot moving, kept the laughs coming, but it was almost like they didn't know how to end this movie. That being said, I still enjoyed every other aspect of this movie, and it was maybe because I wasn't expecting to as much as I did, that I would say this is a top 3 Broken Lizard movie for me. It's hard to knock Super Troopers out of that number 1 slot. Beerfest on any other given day could probably be number 1 for me, but for the sake of this right now, I'll put it at number 2, although that is the movie of theirs that I have rewatched the most. It is kind of my comfort movie when it comes to Broken Lizard movies. Super Troopers is obviously more iconic and the one that put them on the map. So that being said, I would put this at their number 3 movie, although I don't think if they put this movie out first that their career would have been on the same trajectory. Now, Quasi is their oldest script, and this is the movie they pitched before they did Super Troopers. So I will say things worked out better for them that they didn't make this movie first, because I think if they put out Quasi first, I don't think they would have got to Super Troopers. They definitely would not have got to Beerfest. So sometimes things just work out the way they are intended to. And this is an example of that. I think it was also important that they made this movie now because it does look the best out of any other movie that they've done. And that adds a great deal to it because a lot of it is set design, a lot of it is costumes. You obviously have to make it look somewhat like they are in medieval France, and it did a pretty good job at that. Given it is a comedy, so it doesn't have to look entirely correct. They're not full on making Game of Thrones here. So I think this was the perfect time for them to make this movie. Now, that being said, I think if you are a fan of Broken Lizard and all their other movies, you're going to love this one. It's a lot of what they have done in the past and a little bit more refined when it comes to the production. I don't think it's as memorable as all of their other movies. It's not the same setting to create those memorable quotes that they are known for, but it definitely shows a different side of them that they can really go outside of their genre and still be funny. I don't think it's going to win you over if you haven't enjoyed any other Broken Lizard film. If you're not a fan of Super Troopers, if you're not a fan of Beerfest, this one is not going to be your next favorite movie. Comedy out of any genre is very subjective. So I'm not saying you're going to be rolling around on the floor with side-splitting laughter, but if you watch this with some friends with just the intention of having a good time, I think you will enjoy it. So for Quasi, I give it 3.5 out of 5 Hunchbacks.